They told Sergeant Marcus Hayes it was routine maintenance, a 2-week assignment to fix an old coastal watchtower nobody cared about anymore. But when his squad pushed open the rusted iron door and stepped inside, the smell hit them first, decay and salt and something else, something older. Then they saw the walls, hundreds of marks carved into stone and wood, scratch after scratch, names in languages they couldn't read, dates that made no sense, and tallies that went on forever. Someone had died counting in that tower. Many someones. And as Hayes ran his fingers over the deepest grooves, still sharp after decades, he realized the army had sent them here for a reason, and it wasn't to repair anything. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. October 1944. The truck bounced along the coastal road, its engine growling against the wind that swept in from the Atlantic. In the back, 6 men sat shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms dark against the grey canvas cover. They didn't speak much. The cold had a way of making conversation feel like wasted breath. Sergeant Marcus Hayes sat nearest the tailgate, one hand gripping the metal frame to steady himself. He was 32, older than most of the men under his command, with a face that had learned not to show surprise. He'd been in the army since '42, part of the 366th Engineer Regiment, one of dozens of all-black units scattered across training camps and rear positions, while white divisions shipped out to Europe and the Pacific. They built roads, they dug latrines, they unloaded supply ships in ports where locals wouldn't look them in the eye. This assignment was supposed to be different. That's what Captain Brennan had said when he'd handed Hayes the orders 3 days ago at Fort Devon. A remote watchtower on the Maine coast, Brennan had explained, not bothering to meet Hayes's eyes. Built in the 20s, hasn't been manned since '42. Needs structural repairs before winter. You'll take a squad, assess the damage, make it secure. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Hayes had studied the map. The tower sat on a rocky point 30 miles north of Portland, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through pine forests and fishing villages that had seen better days. "Why us, sir?" Hayes had asked. Brennan had paused, his jaw working like he was chewing something tough. "Because nobody else is available, and because it doesn't matter who does it." That was the truth of it, Hayes thought now as the truck rattled over another pothole. When the work didn't matter, they got the call. Beside him, Corporal James Dutton shifted his weight, trying to find a more comfortable position on the hard bench. Dutton was 24 from Philadelphia, with quick hands and a gift for fixing anything mechanical. He'd been the first man Hayes had requested for the squad. "How much further, Sarge?" Dutton asked, his breath fogging in the cold air. Hayes glanced at his watch. Driver said another 20 minutes. Across from them, Private First Class Leonard Webb stared out at the passing trees, his face unreadable. Webb was the youngest at 19, barely 3 months out of basic training. He was quiet, observant, and carried a small notebook where he wrote things down. Letters to his mother mostly, though Hayes suspected he recorded more than that. Next to Webb sat Private Samuel Cross and Private Eddie Reeves, both from Georgia, both with the kind of bond that came from growing up in the same county and surviving the same hardships. Cross was built like a boxer, compact and solid. Reeves was taller, thinner, with nervous energy that made him tap his fingers against his knee. The last man was Private Calvin Porter, from Detroit, who'd worked in an auto factory before the war, and still wore grease under his fingernails no matter how much he scrubbed. He had a way of looking at structures and seeing how they fit together, what held them up and what would make them fall. "Think there's a view?" Reeves asked, trying to lighten the mood. "All that ocean out there." "If there is, we won't have time to enjoy it," Hayes said. "We're there to work." The truck slowed, gears grinding as it turned onto an even narrower road. Through gaps in the canvas, Hayes caught glimpses of the coastline now, grey water stretching to the horizon, waves breaking white against black rocks. The sky was the colour of old iron, heavy with the promise of rain. When the truck finally stopped, the silence that followed felt louder than the engine had been. The driver, a white private who hadn't said 10 words the entire trip, appeared at the tailgate. "This is it," he said flatly. "I'll be back in 2 weeks, maybe sooner if the weather turns." Hayes jumped down, his boots hitting packed earth. The others followed, stretching stiff limbs and shouldering their packs. The air here was different, sharp with salt and cold, carrying the smell of pine and something metallic that Hayes couldn't place. The watchtower stood about 200 yards ahead, perched on the highest point of the rocky peninsula. It was taller than Hayes had expected, maybe 50 feet, built from dark stone that had weathered decades of Atlantic storms. The structure was cylindrical, topped with what had once been an observation platform enclosed by iron railings, now orange with rust. A smaller building, probably the old barracks, sat beside it, its roof sagging in the middle. "Looks like it's been abandoned a while," Dutton muttered. The truck pulled away, its engine fading until all that remained was the sound of wind and distant surf. Hayes felt the isolation settle over them like a weight. No other buildings, no roads except the one they'd come in on, just the tower, the rocks, and the ocean. "All right," Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority that came naturally now. "Let's get a look inside. Porter, Cross, check the barracks. Dutton, Reeves, you're with me on the tower. Webb, perimeter sweep. I want to know what we're dealing with before we unload the gear." They moved with practiced efficiency, each man knowing his role. Hayes approached the tower's entrance, a heavy wooden door set into an arched stone frame. The door was closed, but not locked. When he pushed, it resisted, hinges screaming in protest, and then swung inward with a groan that echoed up through the structure. The smell hit him immediately. Decay, yes, but also something older, the scent of stone that had been closed off from air and light for too long. Hayes stepped inside, Dutton and Reeves following close behind. The interior was circular, maybe 20 feet across, with a stone floor covered in debris, leaves, animal droppings, and what looked like the remains of old furniture. A metal staircase spiraled up along the wall, disappearing into shadows above. Narrow windows, little more than slits in the stone, let in weak bars of grey light. But it was the walls that stopped Hayes cold. They were covered in marks, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, carved into the stone with something sharp, scratched into the wooden support beams, even etched into the metal of the staircase railing. Lines, tallies grouped in fives, names, dates, words in languages Hayes didn't recognize. Dutton moved closer to one section, his fingers hovering over the carved surface. "What the hell is this?" Hayes stepped forward, his eyes scanning the marks. Some were crude, hasty scratches. Others were deliberate, carved with care and precision. Near the door, someone had written in English, their letters uneven but readable. "God forgive us," Dutton read aloud. "October 17th, 1918. Reeves moved to another section. There's more over here. Names. Look, Schmidt, Müller. These are German names." Hayes felt something cold settle in his chest. 1918, the end of the First War, and German names carved into the walls of an American military watchtower. "Sarge," Dutton said quietly, pointing upward. "There's more. All the way up." Hayes tilted his head back. The spiral staircase was lined with marks on both sides, a continuous record climbing toward the observation platform. Some sections were so dense with scratches, they looked like solid masses of lines. "What was this place?" Reeves whispered. Before Hayes could answer, Webb appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. "Sergeant, you need to see the barracks." They crossed the short distance to the smaller building. The door here hung crooked on one hinge. Inside, the space was long and narrow, with the remains of metal bed frames rusted against the walls. But it was the floor that drew Hayes's attention. Someone had painted a large white circle in the center of the room, the paint faded but still visible. Around it, more marks covered the walls, but these were different, more desperate. The scratches here were deeper, angrier, some of them gouged so far into the wood that splinters jutted out. Cross stood near the far wall, his face tight. "There's dates here too, Sarge. 1917, 1918, and something else." He pointed to a section where someone had carved a single word over and over, each repetition larger than the last. "Vergessen," Cross read slowly. "What's that mean?" "German," Webb said quietly. "It means forgotten." The 6 men stood in the ruined barracks, the wind rattling the broken windows, and Hayes felt the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. This wasn't an abandoned watchtower. It was something else, something the army had left behind, and now they were supposed to repair it. "Nobody touches anything yet," Hayes said finally. We document everything first. Webb, get your notebook. I want photographs if we can manage it, detailed notes if we can't. Dutton, check the structure, see what's safe to climb. The rest of you start cataloguing these marks. Anything that looks like it might tell us what happened here. You think someone's going to care? Reeves asked, his voice uncertain. Hayes looked at the carved word again. Forgotten. I don't know, he said, but we're going to find out. As they began their work, the clouds opened and rain started to fall, drumming against the tower's stone walls, and Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been sent here not to repair anything but to bury something deeper. The marks on the walls were trying to tell them a story, and whatever that story was, someone had wanted it to stay silent. The rain fell harder as the afternoon wore on, turning the ground around the tower into mud. Hayes stood at one of the narrow windows on the second level, watching water stream down the glass, distorting the view of the ocean beyond. Behind him, Webb sat cross-legged on the metal stairs, his notebook balanced on his knee, copying down marks and dates with careful precision. Sergeant, Webb said without looking up, I've counted 43 different names so far. Most of them German, but there's also Dutch, I think, and something that might be Russian or Polish. I can't be sure. Hayes turned from the window. The second level of the tower was in better condition than the ground floor, though marks still covered every surface. Here the messages were more structured, organized into columns and rows like someone had been keeping records. Dates? Hayes asked. Earliest I've found is March 1917. Latest is November 1918. Webb flipped back a few pages. But there's a gap. Nothing between August and October 1918. Then suddenly there's dozens of new marks all at once, all in the same few days. Dutton appeared at the top of the stairs, his uniform wet from checking the observation platform. Structure's sound enough, he reported. Rails are rusted through in places, but the stonework is solid. I found something else, though. He held out a piece of metal, rectangular and bent. Dog tag, German, found it wedged between two stones up top. Hayes took it, brushing off the rust. The stamped letters were barely readable, but he could make out a name. Adalbert Fischer. And below it, a unit designation he didn't recognize. There's no way this was a regular watch post, Dutton said quietly. Not with German prisoners here. POW camp, Webb said, still writing. Had to be. But I've never heard of one this far north, this isolated. Hayes had been thinking the same thing. During the First War, German prisoners had been held in camps across the United States, but those were documented, inspected by neutral observers, subject to international agreements. This place felt different, hidden. The sound of boots on stone made them turn. Porter and Cross climbed the stairs, both carrying wooden crates they'd found in the barracks. You need to see what we found, Cross said, setting his crate down carefully. Inside were papers, dozens of them, some loose, others bound with string that had rotted through. The ink had faded to brown, and many pages were stuck together with moisture and age, but enough remained legible. Hayes lifted the top document carefully. It was a requisition form dated April 1917, requesting food supplies for 35 men. The signature at the bottom was illegible, but the unit designation was clear. Coastal Defense Station 7. There's more, Porter said, pulling out another bundle. Medical records. Look at the causes of death. Hayes scanned the page. 3 names, 3 dates in October 1918. Cause of death listed as influenza. Then another page. 5 more names, same month, same cause. He kept reading. Page after page, death after death, all within a span of 2 weeks. The Spanish flu, Webb said softly. It hit the camps hard. I read about it. Killed more soldiers than the war did in some places. But something about the records felt wrong to Hayes. The handwriting changed between pages, sometimes mid-sentence. Dates were out of order, and some entries had been crossed out, written over, like someone had tried to hide them. Reeves came up the stairs, his face troubled. Found something in the barracks, under the floorboards. They followed him back across the muddy ground. Inside the barracks, Reeves had pried up several boards near the painted circle. In the cavity beneath, more papers had been wrapped in oilcloth, protected from the moisture that had destroyed so much else. Hayes unwrapped the bundle carefully. These documents were different. Personal letters, written in German, never sent. A diary with entries that stopped abruptly mid-page. And photographs, small ones, the kind soldiers carried of families left behind. Men in German uniforms smiled out at them from another time, frozen in moments before this place had broken them. One photograph showed the tower itself, but the image was from decades ago when the stone was still new and the observation platform hadn't yet rusted. In front of the tower stood a group of men, maybe 20 of them, in a mixture of German military uniforms and civilian clothes. Their faces were gaunt, exhausted. Behind them stood 3 American soldiers with rifles. Hayes turned the photograph over. Someone had written on the back in English, "Coastal Defense Detachment, October 12, 1918. Final count." Final count of what? Dutton asked. Webb had moved to the wall again, studying the marks with new understanding. These aren't just random scratches. They're keeping track. Days, maybe. Or people. He pointed to one section where the tallies were grouped carefully, 5 lines crossed by a 6th over and over. Someone was counting something. And look here. He indicated a spot where the pattern broke, where instead of neat groups the lines became frantic, overlapping, carved so deep they'd split the wood. Cross had opened the diary, though reading it was difficult. "It's in German," he said. "But I recognize some words. My grandmother spoke German when I was young. This word, Krankenhaus, that's hospital. And this one, Todd, that's death." "What were they doing here?" Reeves asked, his voice tight. "Why isn't this in any records?" Hayes carefully gathered the documents, his mind working through possibilities he didn't want to consider. A hidden camp, deaths that weren't properly reported, evidence buried under floorboards. And now, 26 years later, the army sends a squad to repair it with orders that had felt deliberately vague. "Webb," Hayes said, "I want you to compile everything we've found. Make copies of the dates, the names, everything. If these documents fall apart, I want a record." "You think someone's going to ask us about this?" Dutton said. "I think someone already knows about it," Hayes replied, "and I think that's exactly why we're here." As if to emphasize his words, thunder rolled across the ocean, and the rain intensified, hammering against the roof. They were 30 miles from the nearest town, 2 weeks from pickup, and standing in the middle of a secret that someone had tried very hard to bury. That night, they set up camp in the barracks, clearing space among the old bed frames and hanging tarps over the holes in the roof. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and the wind had picked up, making the whole structure groan. They ate cold rations, too cautious to light a fire inside the damaged building. Hayes sat apart from the others, studying the documents by flashlight. The more he read, the darker the picture became. The requisition forms showed supplies for 40 men in April 1917, but by October 1918, requests were for only 12. Medical records listed cause after cause of death, but the details were sparse, clinical, as if someone had been trying to minimize what had happened. One letter, written in careful English by someone who'd learned the language imperfectly, stood out. It was addressed to a wife in Hamburg, dated October 15, 1918. "My dearest Greta, I do not know if you will receive this letter. They say the war is ending, that soon we will go home, but I fear I will not see Hamburg again. The sickness has taken so many. We are only 8 now. They keep us separate from the others, far from any help. I think they hope we will all die quietly, so no one has to explain why we are here. If I do not return, know that I thought of you every day. Tell our children their father tried to come home. The letter was unsigned, never sent." Hayes wondered if the man had died before he could finish it, or if he'd simply given up hope that it would reach anyone who cared. "Sarge?" Dutton's voice broke through his thoughts. "You should rest. We've got a lot of work ahead." Hayes looked up. His men had arranged their bedrolls, trying to find dry spots on the floor. They looked tired, unsettled by what they'd found, but trusting him to know what to do next. The problem was, Hayes didn't know. They'd been sent to repair a building, and instead they'd uncovered evidence of something the military had hidden for decades. Reporting it might do nothing, or it might cause trouble neither he nor his men could afford. In a segregated army that barely trusted them with shovels, speaking up about scandals could get a black soldier labeled as a troublemaker, or worse. But the marks on those walls deserved more than silence. The men who'd carved them, who'd died here alone and forgotten, deserved more than to be buried again under fresh paint and official indifference. "Tomorrow we finish the survey," Hayes said finally. "We document everything, photograph what we can, copy the rest. Then we decide." The men nodded, settling into their bedrolls. Outside, the storm continued, and somewhere in the darkness the tower stood like a tombstone, its walls still carrying the weight of voices that had stopped calling for help a long time ago. Hayes lay awake listening to the wind, thinking about the photograph he'd found. The German prisoners standing in front of the tower, their faces hollow with exhaustion, the American guards behind them, expressions hidden by shadow. And in the background, barely visible, the ocean stretching away to a horizon none of those men would ever reach. "Final count," the caption had said. Hayes closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Because now he understood what the marks on the walls were counting. Not days, not months. They were counting the dead, and someone had stopped counting before everyone was gone. Morning came grey and cold, the storm having passed but leaving behind a fog so thick Hayes could barely see the ocean from the tower window. The men moved quietly through their morning routine, the weight of yesterday's discoveries hanging over them like the mist outside. After a breakfast of cold rations and weak coffee, Hayes divided them into teams. Porter and Cross would continue examining the barracks for more hidden documents. Dutton and Reeves would assess the structural damage they'd ostensibly been sent to repair. Webb would stay with Hayes in the tower, cataloguing the marks and translating what he could. By mid-morning, Webb had filled 20 pages of his notebook with careful notations. He sat on the third level now, copying a section of text that someone had carved with extraordinary precision into a wooden beam. "This one's different," Webb said, as Hayes climbed the stairs to check on him. "It's not a name or a date, it's a statement. In English." Hayes moved closer. The carved words were small but deliberate, each letter formed with care. "We were 42 when they brought us here. We are 12 now. They told the Red Cross we were transferred. They told our families we were alive and well. They lied. If anyone finds this, know that we died not from sickness alone, but from neglect, from being forgotten on purpose. Below it, a name. Johann Kepler. And a date. October 28th, 1918. 4 days before the armistice," Webb said quietly. The war was almost over. Hayes felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't just about the Spanish flu, about a medical crisis that had overwhelmed an isolated camp. This was about men who'd been deliberately abandoned, hidden away where their deaths wouldn't create complications. The sound of boots on stone announced Dutton's arrival. His face was grim. "Sarge, you need to come see what we found outside." They followed him down and around to the back of the tower, where the rocky ground sloped toward the ocean. Reeves stood near a depression in the earth, maybe 30 feet long and 15 wide. At first, Hayes thought it was just a natural dip in the landscape, but as he got closer, he could see it had been deliberately dug, then filled in. "Mass grave," Reeves said, his voice flat. "Has to be. Look at the edges. Someone dug this with tools, buried something, then tried to make it look natural again." Dutton crouched down, brushing away wet leaves and moss. "The ground settled different here. And look." He pointed to several small metal objects partially exposed by the rain, dog tags rusted but still attached to chains that disappeared into the soil. Hayes knelt beside him, his heart pounding. He could make out names on the tags. Fisher, Bauer, Schmidt. The same names they'd found carved inside the tower. "How many do you think?" Reeves asked. 20, maybe 30, Dutton said. "Hard to say without excavating." "We're not digging them up," Hayes said firmly. "We document the location, photograph it if we can, but we don't touch it." "Why not?" Reeves challenged, his voice rising. "These men deserve proper burials. They deserve to be identified, sent home to their families." "And who's going to authorize that?" Hayes shot back. "You think we call Fort Devon and tell them we found an unmarked mass grave of German POWs, and they'll thank us for the information? You think they'll send investigators and honor guards?" The silence that followed was heavy. They all knew the answer. They all understood the position they were in. Porter's voice called from the barracks. "Sergeant Hayes, you need to see this." They found Porter and Cross standing over another cache of documents they'd pulled from a different hiding place, this one behind a loose stone in the barracks wall. But these weren't letters or diaries. They were official military reports, stamped with unit designations and signed by officers. Hayes picked up the top sheet. It was dated September 1918, written by someone identified as Captain William Thatcher, commanding officer of Coastal Defense Station 7. The report detailed an outbreak of Spanish influenza among the prisoners, requesting medical supplies and additional personnel. The next document was a response dated a week later. Request denied. Maintain quarantine. No external contact authorized. Hayes flipped through more reports. Each one told the same story. Thatcher requesting help, supplies, medical staff. The requests being denied, ignored, or delayed until they became meaningless. By mid-October, Thatcher's reports had become desperate, his handwriting deteriorating into barely legible scrawls. 12 men remain, no medical supplies received. Request permission to evacuate survivors to nearest hospital facility. Situation critical. The response, when it came, was brief and damning. Maintain quarantine until further notice. Under no circumstances are prisoners to be transferred or have contact with civilian population. This matter is to be handled internally and with complete discretion. The signature at the bottom belonged to a colonel whose name Hayes didn't recognize, but the implication was clear. The men in this camp had been left to die because moving them, treating them properly, acknowledging their existence, would have created problems the military didn't want to deal with. The final report from Thatcher was dated November 2nd, 1918, 9 days before the armistice. All prisoners deceased as of this date, requesting instructions for proper burial and documentation, await orders. There was no response attached to that report, no orders, no acknowledgement, just silence. Cross sat down heavily on one of the rusted bed frames. They let them die, knew they were dying and just left them here. Not just the prisoners, Webb said quietly. He held up another document, this one a casualty report. Captain Thatcher died November 15, 1918. Official cause of death listed as influenza, but he's buried in a military cemetery in Portland, with honors. And the guards? Dutton asked. Webb shook his head. 2 others are listed as transferred to other units right after the camp closed. No mention of illness. Convenient. Hayes could see his men processing the information, their faces showing a mixture of anger, disgust, and something else. Recognition, maybe. Because they all understood what it meant to be expendable, to be sent somewhere no one was watching, to serve a country that didn't always see them as fully human. This is why they sent us, Reeves said bitterly. All the way out here, middle of nowhere. They knew what was in this tower. They wanted someone to clean it up quietly. Or they wanted to see if we'd keep our mouths shut, Porter added. Hayes wanted to argue, to tell them they were jumping to conclusions, but he couldn't. The timing was too perfect, the assignment too deliberately vague. Someone knew what was buried here, and they'd sent an all-black engineering squad. Men who understood the cost of speaking up, men who knew how easily careers could be ended, and worse. So what do we do? Cross asked, looking at Hayes. Report it, stay quiet, what? Before Hayes could answer, Webb spoke up. We document everything, every mark, every name, every document. We make copies, take photographs, create a record that can't be lost or destroyed. And then what? Reeves pressed. We hand it over to Captain Brennan and hope he does the right thing? You know what'll happen, it'll disappear. Filed away somewhere, classified until everyone involved is dead. Maybe, Hayes said slowly. But if we do nothing, if we walk away and let this stay buried, then we're part of it. We become the ones who knew and stayed silent. Dutton stood up, pacing the small space. And if we report it, if we make noise about this, you know what happens to us. We get labeled troublemakers. We get split up, sent to different units, maybe discharged under less than honorable circumstances. Our families back home pay the price too. It was the truth none of them wanted to acknowledge. In 1944, a black soldier who challenged authority, who exposed military scandals, who demanded accountability, was asking for a world of trouble. The segregated army had its rules, and one of them was knowing when to keep your head down. Hayes looked at the documents spread across the floor, at the names carved into the walls around them, at his men waiting for him to decide. 42 German prisoners had died in this place, forgotten and abandoned. Their families had never been told the truth. The men who'd let them die had faced no consequences, and now, 26 years later, 6 black soldiers stood in the same place, facing the same choice. Speak up and risk everything, or stay silent and become part of the machine that buried inconvenient truths. "We finish the job," Hayes said finally. "We document everything. We make multiple copies and we keep them separate. Then we write our report, factual and complete, and we submit it through proper channels. What happens after that we can't control, but we'll have done our duty, the right way." "You really think that'll matter?" Reeves asked. Hayes met his eyes. "I think those men in that grave deserve to matter. I think Captain Thatcher, dying up here alone trying to save them, deserved to matter. And I think if we walk away from this, we're saying they don't. That's not who I am. That's not who any of us should be." The men were quiet for a long moment. Then, one by one, they nodded. "All right," Dutton said. "We do it the right way." They spent the rest of the day working with renewed purpose. Webb methodically copied every legible mark and message from the tower walls. Porter photographed the documents using a camera they'd brought for structural assessment, cross-measured and mapped the grave site with careful precision. Reeves compiled a timeline of events based on the dates they'd found. As evening approached and the light began to fail, Hayes stood alone in the tower, looking at the walls that had become a memorial to forgotten men. 42 prisoners had carved their names here, marking their existence in stone because they knew no one else would remember them. They'd been right. For 26 years, no one had. But now, someone knew. And what Hayes' squad did with that knowledge would determine whether these men's deaths meant something, or whether they'd be buried again, this time under paperwork and official silence. Outside, fog rolled in from the ocean again, wrapping the tower in grey. Tomorrow they would finish their documentation. The day after, they would begin the repairs they'd been sent to make, fixing the structure while carrying the weight of what they'd found inside it. And in 2 weeks, when the truck came to take them back to Fort Devon, they would carry with them a truth that powerful people had tried very hard to hide. What they chose to do with that truth would define them far more than any military decoration ever could. Hayes descended the stairs slowly, running his hand along the marks carved into the stone. Under his fingers, the names of dead men whispered their stories, and he made them a silent promise. "You won't be forgotten again." The next 10 days passed in a rhythm of work that felt almost sacred. By day, they repaired what needed repairing, replaced rotted beams, sealed cracks in the stone, made the tower structurally sound again. By night, they continued their real work, documenting the evidence of what had happened here 26 years ago. Webb filled 3 notebooks with careful transcriptions. Porter took over 200 photographs, using every angle of light to capture the marks on the walls, the documents, the grave site. Cross drew detailed maps showing the layout of the camp, the location of every significant finding. Reeves compiled a master list of names, 42 German prisoners, 3 American guards, all connected to this forgotten place. Hayes wrote the report himself, working by flashlight after the others had gone to sleep. He kept the language precise, factual, devoid of emotion or accusation, just the evidence presented clearly. What happened, when it happened, what they had found. He made 4 copies by hand, each one taking hours of careful transcription. On the 11th day, Dutton found something that changed everything. He'd been inspecting the observation platform, checking the integrity of the iron railing, when his hand brushed against something carved into the underside of the stone parapet. The marks were protected from weather, still sharp after decades. "Sergeant," he called down, "you need to see this." Hayes climbed the narrow stairs, emerging onto the platform where wind from the ocean whipped at his uniform. Dutton pointed to the carved text, and Hayes crouched down to read it. The words were in English, carved with precision, dated November 3rd, 1918. "My name is Captain William Thatcher. I commanded this station for 18 months. 42 men died under my watch because I followed orders instead of my conscience. I requested help. I was denied. I requested evacuation. I was denied. I stayed silent when silence meant death. If you are reading this, know that I bear the guilt of their deaths. I could have gone to the newspapers. I could have contacted the Red Cross directly. I could have disobeyed orders that were morally indefensible. I did none of these things. I told myself I was following protocol, maintaining discipline, serving my country. But the truth is I was afraid. afraid of courts-martial, afraid of disgrace, afraid of consequences. My fear killed these men as surely as the disease did. Do not make my mistake. Some orders should not be followed, some secrets should not be kept. The truth matters more than rank, more than protocol, more than personal safety. Remember us. Remember what happens when good men stay silent. Below the message, Thatcher had carved the names of all 42 prisoners. Each one spelled out completely. No abbreviations, no shortcuts. It must have taken him days. Hayes read the message twice, his hands shaking slightly. Here was the answer to the question that had haunted him for 11 days. What should they do? What was the right choice? Thatcher had given them his answer, carved in stone, paid for with guilt that had likely followed him to his grave. He knew, Webb said quietly. He'd followed Hayes up the stairs. He knew staying silent was wrong, and he did it anyway. And it destroyed him. Hayes looked out at the ocean, at the grey water stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, German families had spent 26 years not knowing what happened to their sons, their fathers, their brothers. Somewhere the families of these soldiers had accepted official lies because challenging them seemed impossible. And now 6 men stood in the same position Thatcher had been in, facing the same choice. Stay silent and safe, or speak up and accept the consequences. But Thatcher had given them something he hadn't had, a clear warning, a message from the future, carved by a man who'd made the wrong choice and knew it. We tell the truth, Hayes said, all of it, no matter what happens. When the truck finally arrived on the 14th day, Hayes and his squad were ready. They'd completed their repairs, fulfilled their official mission. The tower was structurally sound, sealed against winter weather, ready for whatever the army decided to do with it. But they also carried with them 4 complete sets of documentation, distributed among different packs so no single accident could destroy the evidence. Webb had sewn one set into the lining of his coat. Porter had buried another in a waterproof container near the gravesite, marked with coordinates only they knew. Cross carried a third set, and Hayes kept the fourth along with the original report. The driver was the same private who'd dropped them off, still sullen and uncommunicative. He barely glanced at them as they loaded their gear. "How'd it go?" he asked without real interest. "Job's done," Hayes replied. The drive back seemed longer than the journey out. None of the men slept, despite their exhaustion. They watched the landscape pass, each of them processing what the next days would bring. At Fort Devon, Hayes went directly to Captain Brennan's office. The captain looked up from his paperwork with mild surprise. "Hayes, you're back early. Any problems?" "No problems with the repairs, sir, but there's something you need to see." Hayes placed the report on Brennan's desk. The captain picked it up, frowning, and began to read. Hayes watched his face change as he turned pages. Confusion first, then concern, then something that might have been anger or fear. "Where did you find all this?" Brennan asked, his voice tight. "In the tower and the barracks, sir, hidden under floorboards, behind walls. We documented everything, made copies, took photographs." "Photographs," Brennan repeated. He set down the report carefully as if it might explode. "Sergeant, do you understand what you're handing me?" "Yes, sir. Evidence of negligence resulting in the deaths of 42 prisoners of war during the last conflict. Evidence that proper procedures weren't followed, that requests for help were denied, that deaths were covered up. Evidence," Brennan said slowly, "that will embarrass a lot of very powerful people if it becomes public. Evidence that raises questions about how we treated prisoners then, which could affect how the enemy treats our boys now. Evidence that could undermine morale, damage the war effort, create international incidents." Hayes met his eyes. "Evidence of the truth, sir." Brennan stood up, pacing to the window. "You're putting me in an impossible position, Hayes. If I file this report, it goes up the chain. It gets investigated, probably buried, and everyone involved, including you and your men, gets marked. Troublemakers, men who can't follow simple orders. You understand what that means for soldiers like you?" "I understand, sir. And if I don't file it? If I lose this report and we all pretend you spent 2 weeks fixing a tower and nothing else?" Hayes had expected this. "Then we file it ourselves, sir. Through other channels. We contact the Red Cross. We write to newspapers. We do whatever it takes to make sure those men aren't forgotten again." Brennan turned sharply. That's insubordination, Sergeant. That's a court-martial offense. Yes, sir, Hayes said calmly. It is. The two men stared at each other across the office. Outside, the sounds of the base continued, normal and ordinary, men drilling, trucks moving, the machinery of war grinding forward. Why? Brennan asked finally. Why risk everything for men who died before you were born? German soldiers, no less. The enemy. Hayes thought about the marks on the walls, about Johann Kepler's carved declaration, about Thatcher's confession carved in stone, about 42 men who'd died alone, abandoned, forgotten. Because it's the right thing to do, sir, he said simply. And because if we don't stand up for what's right when it's difficult, then what are we fighting for? Brennan was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up the report again, weighing it in his hands. I'll forward this, he said finally. Up the chain, proper channels, by the book. It'll probably disappear into some filing cabinet in Washington, but it'll be on record. What happens after that I can't control. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Brennan said sharply. You've just made your life a lot more complicated, Sergeant. All of you. I hope the truth was worth it. Hayes saluted and left the office. Outside, his men waited, their faces questioning. It's done, Hayes told them. We did what we came to do. They were reassigned 3 weeks later. The squad was broken up, each man sent to a different unit, different base, different job. The official reason was operational necessity, but they all knew the real reason. Spreading them out, making sure they couldn't collaborate, couldn't keep pushing their story. Webb went to a supply depot in Virginia, Porter to an engineering company in Georgia, Cross and Reeves to separate maintenance units in Texas, Dutton to a training facility in Oklahoma. Hayes was transferred to a transportation company in New Jersey, about as far from combat and glory as the Army could send him. His efficiency reports, once exemplary, became merely adequate. Promotions that should have come didn't. Recommendations he submitted for his men went unanswered. The message was clear. They'd done what was right, and they were paying for it. But on a cold December evening in 1944, sitting in a barracks far from that main tower, Hayes received a letter. It was from Webb, carefully worded to avoid censors, but the meaning was clear. Package received by intended party. Confirmed arrival. Contents being reviewed. The Red Cross had gotten their documentation. The evidence wouldn't be buried after all. What came of it, they might never know. But the truth was out there now, recorded, preserved, impossible to completely erase. Hayes folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his pocket. Through the window, he could see snow beginning to fall, covering the base in white. Somewhere in Germany, the war ground on. Somewhere in Washington, officials were probably trying to contain the story his squad had brought back. Somewhere, the families of 42 German soldiers might finally learn what had happened to their loved ones. Or maybe not. Maybe the machinery of bureaucracy would crush this like it crushed so many other inconvenient truths. Maybe their sacrifice would accomplish nothing. But Hayes didn't regret it. None of them did, because they'd looked at those marks on the walls, those desperate messages carved by dying men, and they'd made a choice. To speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. To refuse to be part of the silence that had killed 42 men and broken the man who'd tried to save them. They'd done the right thing, even when the right thing was hard, even when it cost them. And that mattered. Not because it would change the world, but because it changed them, because it meant they'd served their country not just with their hands and backs, but with their conscience and courage. Years later, after the war ended and the records were declassified, a researcher would find Hayes's report in a file marked unresolved cases. The researcher would track down the tower, would confirm the gravesite, would contact German authorities. The prisoners would be identified, their families notified, their names added to official casualty lists. The researcher would interview Hayes, by then an old man, and ask him if he'd known his report would eventually lead to justice. Hayes would shake his head. "We didn't do it for justice," he'd say. "We did it because those men deserved to be remembered, because the truth matters even when no one's listening, especially then." The tower still stands on that rocky Maine coast, maintained now as a historical site. On its walls, the marks remain, preserved under protective coating. A plaque outside tells the story of what happened there in 1918. It mentions Captain Thatcher, who tried to save his prisoners. It lists the names of the 42 men who died, and it mentions briefly the 6 soldiers who found the evidence in 1944 and refused to let it stay buried. 6 names that might otherwise have been forgotten, recorded now alongside the men they'd given voice to: Sergeant Marcus Hayes, Corporal James Dutton, Private First Class Leonard Webb, Private Samuel Cross, Private Eddie Reeves, Private Calvin Porter, men who understood that doing the right thing doesn't always lead to reward, but who did it anyway. Because some truths are more important than careers. Some voices deserve to be heard, even decades after they fall silent. And some silences need to be broken, no matter the cost. The marks on the walls told a terrifying story. But the real story, the one that mattered most, was what 6 soldiers chose to do when they found it. They chose courage over safety, truth over silence, conscience over orders. They chose to remember, and in the end, that choice echoed far longer than any of them could have imagined.